WhatsApp, you know.
Mm.
So we're being recorded now.
I just, I just tried. I thought, oh my gosh, do I have her number?
Lucky.
Do you want us to turn off our audio while the others are speaking, or should we?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
that
so
would
I'm
be a
going to
good
go ahead
idea.
and mute myself for now.
I know it's always nervous, right? I could never sleep through this, like I would be waking up 10 times because I'm not an early morning person. And so,
Yeah, yeah.
you
I
know,
think she also is not, and it was just very unfortunate, the time distance. I'm sorry, the tyranny of American time that
oh
makes
yeah,
other people wake up at odd hours. So,
I know I've done like so many like panel discussions where it's like middle of the night or late at night, and so
yeah.
9:30, 10:30 at night, 2 a.m., 1:30, yeah.
How many of these South Asia conversations have you sponsored so far this semester?
So this is our first one for spring, but we had them for winter, we had them for fall,
Oh,
we had them the whole of last year.
okay.
So this is a series that's been going on for several years now. I think it's been 6 years that
Yeah, I know Doug Haynes, who used
Doug
to be
Haynes
in the
was
history
behind it.
department.
Yeah. So
He started something along that line. Can
yeah.
you put
So
me on the mailing list so that I can see what's coming up in the future?
I will put you on the mailing list. So
Something that I might be interested in attending more regularly.
right. So this is the main sort of intellectual fulcrum of like South Asian studies at Dartmouth. Like, we try to invite scholars and have conversations.
Yeah.
The main way we foster a community on South Asia within, it's a very small college, Dartmouth. We don't have a South
Yes.
Asian studies program, so we just,
Right.
yeah.
But you have an endowment, I saw,
We have an
for South
endowment.
Asia.
We have an endowment.
That's
Sadly,
good.
we don't have a lot of faculty doing South Asia studies, which should change hopefully, but we do have an endowment.
Mhm.
And Susan made that joke, right? That it's early in the morning, so I'll try to be presentable. I think she had a foreboding for this. So I was like, you warned us well.
I mean, she can just do it in her pajamas from her bed. As long as she does it, she's here
Yeah.
somehow.
I know, Faiza, how you're feeling at this
Like,
moment.
just sit in a tub, take a bath, and just put it on, just get it somehow.
Turn the camera off.
Just, yeah, well.
Yeah, a student of mine is like commenting, I was on my way in, I'm waiting in room. I'm in the waiting room. What's happening?
Okay. Navya, just check if there are more people in the waiting room and we can let them in while
Yeah, I
Susan
can
goes.
check that right now.
So is this delay going to cut into our presentation time, or should we just still plan on 10 minutes each?
No, please plan on 10 minutes each, and please plan on whatever, everything that you have prepared. I think we should be able to squeeze everything in just fine.
Okay. And it's just like 15 minutes
A
off,
little bit less Q&A then, I guess.
Yeah, we are supposed to start at 4:15, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah,
just
we're a bit
15.
late. I guess it's okay to keep a margin for someone who's in Australia, which is like a drastically different time zone. So,
Yep.
okay.
She says she has to download something.
Oh, for her presentation.
No, no, no. The link. Try the link.
Well, Faiza got off.
Oh no, I'm here
Oh, you're
actually.
there. Okay, you just
Yeah.
turned your camera off.
Yeah.
If you
It's
can send her an email, I told her, she said that her internet is being slow and difficult, and it says I have to download something. I'm trying to get on.
Can
I'm so
send her a
sorry.
link, direct link right now.
You are?
Yeah,
Can
I'm
you
sending
send
her a
it?
new link.
Yeah,
Yeah,
can
I'm
you
sending
send
her
it?
a new link.
Because I just clicked on the link you sent.
Yeah, it seemed to work, but I did send her a link yesterday too, and I think Navya
Mhm.
can send it now.
I
And we
just
were
got an email
worried.
from a colleague of mine who said he's having problems
Okay.
joining. Zoom isn't allowing him to get on.
Yeah, she said she should be on in 1 minute. She asked
Okay.
me to apologize to everyone.
No, it's fine. Um, Navya, I think there are some more attendees trying to join and they're having trouble with the link, so I don't know. Are you here?
Yeah, I checked. There's no one in the waiting room, so everyone should be coming straight in. There is a possibility people who were in the waiting room, because of some technical issues, sometimes we have those problems that they get stuck there even when I go live. So if someone's having a problem, they can try to rejoin and they should come straight in.
Okay.
Okay, I'm emailing my friend with that.
Is this a big program y'all have on South Asian studies?
I would say it's a big program. I guess it's the main program in South Asia studies that we have at Dartmouth. It's a conversation series. We try to, do it twice every quarter just to make sure that there is, intellectual energy around South Asian studies. We don't have a South Asia program as such. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
So it's just the Asian studies program?
Yes, we have a Department of Asian Studies, the ASCL department, under which, this conversation series is, and, they regularly offer courses on East
Okay.
Asia, Southeast Asia. Recently they've approved a course on Bhutan, so
Really?
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Wow. Who's teaching it?
Actually a lecturer from the religion department, and I can like send you his name. So he's a
Oh,
scholar of
interesting.
Tibetan Buddhism and he's expanding that frame of analysis into Bhutan. So I always
Interesting.
feel like Bhutan is a very understudied part of Southeast Asia, which is why I was very
South
surprised.
Asia.
I mean,
Yeah.
happy, pleasantly surprised to see Susan's book and feature it.
Don't forget Sikkim.
Sikkim, yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
Sikkim kind of falls under India, right? So,
Yeah, it does, but no one ever studies it, rarely.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but it has a similar history in many ways. Okay, looks like we're all present now.
Hi, Susan.
Hello.
Good
I'm
morning.
Hi.
so sorry. Please
Excuse
forgive
me
me for
for
No,
that.
no, it's all good. We're glad you're here. Thank you so much for waking up so early. It's the
Oh,
most
no, no. I
ungodly,
had my alarm set. It didn't do.
it's the most ungodly of hours. Okay, do you have a slide deck to share?
I
Or
do.
okay.
Should I just send it to you or should I just share?
Yeah, just check if you're able to share it and then I'll make the introductions and we can start.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, guys. Really
No.
not my Frank. It's strange to meet you.
Same here, Susan.
And what luck that I had your phone number.
Good luck, yeah. Okay, here we
Yeah,
go.
it seems to work. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining the first spring session for the Conversations of South Asia series. This series is hosted at the Department of Asian Societies, Languages and Cultures at Dartmouth College, and it is sponsored by the Bodas Family Endowment Fund. My name is Faiza Rahman, and I'm the coordinator of this series. I'm the postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows and a lecturer in the Department of Religion. Today, with a little bit of delay, we have, but which is fine because our guest was, in Australia, which is a very different time zone. We are gathered for a discussion on Susan Banki's book, The Ecosystem of Exile Politics: Why Proximity and Precarity Matter for Bhutan's Homeland Activists, published by the Cornell University Press in 2014. So, to introduce Susan Banki, she is an associate professor at the University of Sydney and director of the Master of Social Justice program. Her research is centered on questions of sovereignty, transnationalism, and citizenship, and how these have shaped our responses to conflict and injustice, particularly examining institutions such as the international refugee regime, diasporas, and the humanitarian system. Susan's focus is in the Asia-Pacific region, where she has conducted extensive field research in Thailand, Myanmar/Burma, Cambodia, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Japan on refugee protection, statelessness, and border control. Her current projects include the work of diasporas in responding to acute crises at home, humanitarian responses to complex displacement contexts, and the role of creative arts in transnational activism. Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for being here. To introduce our respondents, our first respondent is Dr. Lopita Nath, who is professor and chair of the History Department and coordinator of the Asian Studies program at the University of the Incarnate Word in San Antonio, Texas. Her academic career includes faculty appointments at Cotton University in India, the University of Virginia at Wise, and the College of William and Mary. She is a leading expert in migration studies, refugee issues, and human rights. Dr. Nath's research examines the complexities of South Asian migration, with a particular specialization in Nepali and Bhutanese displacement and the lived experiences of Himalayan migrant communities. She is the author of the seminal work, The Nepalis in Assam: Cross-Border Movements and Ethnicity, which was published in 2003. Her recent contributions include an article on Nepalese, Bhutanese, and Tibetan diasporas in the United States in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Migration Studies, and her forthcoming book on Bhutanese refugee settlement, which will be out in this year. Her extensive publications cover critical themes such as internal displacement in Northeast India, the plight of women refugees, and the role of oral history in refugee research. A dedicated advocate, Dr. Nath has presented her work at the United Nations Commissions on the Status of Women and delivered a TEDx talk on refugee resettlement. Beyond the archives, she is a practitioner of service learning with over 2 decades of experience in empowering underserved communities and fostering global refugee advocacy. Our second respondent is Frank J. Coram, who is Professor Emeritus in Anthropology and Religion at Boston University, a faculty affiliate of Harvard University's program in Folklore and Mythology, and a research associate of the Museum of International Folk Art. He is also currently a senior scholar at the School for Advanced Research, as well as co-editor of the biannual journal Asian Ethnology. He is a South Asianist who has worked extensively on issues of diaspora, transnationalism, and globalization, the author and or editor of 10 books. His current focus is on transnational Sufism originating in the Tamil-speaking portions of Sri Lanka. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And I would now like to invite our author and speaker, Susan, to share her slides and give us an overview of her book.
Thank you so much. Faiza, I have 2 things to say. The first is that I am having an echo. Is anyone else hearing that, Joe?
No.
No? Okay, I'll just
It's
manage it if I have to. I think what I'll have to do is maybe turn down myself very low.
You
There we
have
go.
two windows
Okay,
open.
now I
Is
can't
that
really hear myself, but that means if you need to talk to me, you're gonna have to talk loud and then I'll turn it up. And the second question is, I'm so sorry for being late, but how long should I go? I can cut it a little, but I just wanted to know.
You can take the full 10 to 12 minutes and
Okay,
it should be
great.
fine.
All right, thank you so much. First, I want to say thank you so much for having me, and also what a great honor for me to be in the company of such illustrious colleagues. So, thank you so much to Dr. Nath and Dr. Coram for being here to be discussants. This is one of the joyful parts of being an academic is getting to engage with your work. So, thank you so much. I'm going to just start by showing you the cover, which I'm very proud of because it was actually painted by a Bhutanese refugee himself, Nawal Katiwada. And again, this is one of those moments where you actually get to do the thing that is special. And it's not just sitting at your desk and the writing, but actually making sure that the people about whom we write are involved. So it's greatly a great point of pride for me that I was able to get Cornell University Press to agree to make this the cover. And if you look, you can see on there, it's a bunch of refugees with an IOM bus behind them, because this is the point at which Nawal painted the Bhutanese refugees leaving Nepal. Now, I'm going to tell that story in full detail right now, but I wanted to give you that sense right now of sort of what this important moment looked like. So I start by just saying that I'm telling the story of a lesser known population, the refugees from Bhutan. Everybody knows Bhutan is this place of gross national happiness. That's kind of the thing that most people know the most. And what's lesser known is that there is an ethnic minority population. Sometimes they're called the Lhotshampa, and sometimes they're called Bhutanese Nepalis. And they were expelled in the early 1990s. The 1980s was a time of great marginalization for that population. There were threats to citizenship, um, and there was a feeling among the ethnic minority that the growing ethnic minority population was threatening. And what this meant is that this idea that we have to integrate them, we have to incorporate them. Also, we'd be really happy if they weren't speaking Nepali anymore. Instead, there was this requirement that the population of the South where they resided start to speak in the majority language of Jonka. There were censuses that went through the population to kind of see who was legitimately a citizen and who was not. Now, in these days and age, some people coming to your door to ask you if you were a citizen is something we would frankly wish for. But at that time, it was really considered incredibly threatening and terrifying to those of the southern part of the country where many of the ethnic minority resided. They were not the only ethnic minority, but the one that was targeted the most because they looked different and they sounded different and they practiced differently, which is to say the ethnic Nepalis of the South were darker. They looked more Nepali rather than looked more the ethnic majority that were more sort of Tibetan looking. Most of them were Hindu practicing rather than Buddhist practicing. And of course, they spoke Nepali rather than Jonka. Anyway, there were protests because of this because of these changes, these efforts at integration in the census, and those went south. They just did not go well. There was some violence, and the Bhutanese government decided that they'd had enough, and this led to the expulsion of 1/6 of the population of Bhutan. Now, this is not very well known for a country that most people think of as gross national happiness, but in fact, that's what happened. So in the book, I tell the story of what happened in Nepal and then further after the Bhutanese refugees were expelled from Bhutan. They went through India. A little part of India is this is India here. It's sandwiched between Bhutan and Nepal. And a little part here is what they crossed through in order to get into Nepal. First, when they crossed over into India, they had no idea that they'd be never going back to Bhutan. Many thought this is just a small problem that it's going to solve itself in a little while. But it ended up being, for good. Not one Bhutanese refugee has ever been able to successfully go back to Nepal until very recently, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm sure that Lopita has been following a lot about what's happening with that. Anyway, I give three examples at the beginning of the book where I talk about three different activists and what they ended up doing in Nepal in order to try to, at that time, make efforts to return to Bhutan, change policies in Bhutan so that there would be greater democratization and document human rights abuses. And I won't go into too much detail of those now, but I will say that one was named Ratan Gazmir, and he did a lot of work that was centered on the refugee camp, getting people involved, marches, creating databases that proved all of the things that the Bhutanese government doing. And he did this from the site of the place, which was the Bhutanese refugee camps. We have the story of Mangala Sharma, who was another Bhutanese refugee who was forced. She was an articulate young woman at the time in Bhutan. She worked for UNDP, and she was forced to leave. And she ended up doing all of this work that was, again, to document those abuses by the Bhutanese government, but not only in the camps. She was able to go to conferences, UN conferences, where she spoke in front of the ethnic majority Bhutanese to talk about what had happened to the women of the ethnic minority of the Bhutanese Nepalis. And the international stage served as the place where she did that work. And then finally, I tell the story of Bhakta Gimre, who's this young, at the time, gentleman right here, who from Nepal, with another group, decided to cross back over using this route you see right here through India to try to do marches, to peacefully walk back, to show the international world that this was a peaceful group that wanted nothing more than to simply return to the country of Bhutan. And in this place, because India was a place that had active media, and when the marches were stopped, there was tons of newspaper articles about it. India served as the backdrop for that activism. So I think what I'm telling you here is, with this exile politics, activism targeted toward the home country by those outside of that country, what I'm saying is that there is an ecosystem of exile politics. It happens in Nepal, it happens in the refugee camps, it happens in India, and it happens further afield. And that is the argument of the book. If you have to go now because I was late, but please don't leave, that is the argument of the book, that exile politics functions like an ecosystem that has organisms that have different strategies. There are the producers and the consumers of what I call information. The carbon of activism is information. And they transfer this between themselves. The different hubs of activism transfer between themselves. There are visible forms of activism and subterranean forms of activism, and physical location matters, which is to say where you are relative to Bhutan matters. And that is essentially the argument of the book. The rest of the book is essentially shaped, tells that story, and I'll just go over the foundational literatures, which is the theory part, where I talk about the different theories that I use, that I deploy in order to make this argument. Feel free to ask me questions about that later. I do have a piece on positionality, which I love to tell, but I'm a little low on time, so I'm not going to tell it now. But the short version is that I think it's very important when we write about populations, particularly those that are liminal in some ways, that maybe do not have the same privilege that we do, that don't have the passport or don't have the ability to travel, that we think about why we do the work that we do. And there is a part of the book where I talk about that, and I'll leave it for now. And if you have questions, please let me know. Here's a better map, but we don't have to worry about that. The next chapter of the book, I talk about the background of Bhutan. I'm not a historian, but I did have a lot of fun work reading through documents from the colonial time to really show what the effects were of the colonial period. But I'm gonna hold off on that. What we know, of course, was the creation of the 7 refugee camps that I've already mentioned. Between 60 and 80,000 people were expelled from Bhutan, and they ended up in these refugee camps in Nepal, or most of them did. And there, by the time of a big change that I'll talk about in just a few minutes, there were up to 110,000 Bhutanese Nepalis in the Nepali refugee camps. The Bhutanese government, you would expect, has a very different view on this. What they view is that most were not citizens and they left the country willingly. They were forced to sign something called voluntary migration forms. But the Bhutanese Nepalis say that nearly all of them were citizens, in fact, and they did not leave willingly. They were coerced into signing. This quote here is from one of my research participants, which tells the story of what happened to him. And I will say that it is definitely true in every situation that there is nuance required. Of course, there were a few that left willingly, but the question is how many and to what extent, and we will really never truly know the exact answer to that. Those are such hard questions to answer. But what I will say is my time conducting research over 16 years in and out of the camps leads me to believe that these were truly people that were forced, that did not want to go, that loved dearly their king, that sent birthday cards to the king every year to say, we want to come back. And we're not able to. So in the book, the next 3 chapters are my 3 chapters where I talk about my theory through an empirical lens. In the first, I talk about the power of Can you just wave at me, Faiza, when I have 2 minutes left? Thanks. The first of the empirical chapters talks about the power of proximity, where I show that being proximate to Bhutan was actually quite powerful. And I give all of these different examples of what it was like to be close to Bhutan, not on the border, but just close, and what kinds of activities allowed for a real power in exile politics. There was this digital database where they collected information from all of the refugees in the camps. They were successful in getting 50% of all of the refugees of one camp. And they scanned all of the documentation they had. That picture in the top right corner is one of the most famous you'll see if you Google Bhutanese refugees. And what this showed is their legitimate passports. These are people that had the paperwork and ended up in the camp because there was a claim made that they didn't. And all of these were put onto a scanner, and that CD-ROM at the time, you young students at Dartmouth wouldn't even know what a CD-ROM is, but we do. And that was put into a document database that was given to high-level people to show we were citizens of this country. There were stories told at camp plays that told the story of the Bhutanese Nepalis in Nepal. There were camp publications. There were newsletters. There were marches like the one I told you about that Bhakti Gimre did. There were protests in Kathmandu. And because many of the Bhutanese Nepalis actually knew politicians in India and Nepal, they actually did some lobbying. And they were able to have those connections because they'd been nearby before. I tell an example in the book of one person who snuck back in did not sneak back in. Somebody from a Bhutanese Nepali from within Nepal, from within Bhutan, snuck over the border and shared some photographs of someone's house. And they were able to do that because, of course, they could share the pictures close by. Now, you may say, well, Susan, today, do we really need that? We have the internet, we have photographs, and we'll come to that. The next chapter is the problem of precarity. So maybe it's great to be nearby from the standpoint of being able to do all of these activities and having the sense of collective harm. But being nearby also made refugees far more precarious. In the chapter, I talk about the restrictions that were imposed by the government of Nepal, restrictions on movement, restrictions on doing political activities. I want to say that for the most part, Nepal was a relatively generous host when it comes to housing refugees, but nevertheless, there were some things that were not permitted, and things were permitted at the discretion of the government of Nepal. The UNHCR itself, which is a refugee agency which protects refugees, the refugee agency, restricted that kind of political activity. And thank you. This I find interesting because UNHCR is the agency that protects refugees. You would think that that would be the agency that would permit political expression because, of course, people that leave a country might want to be the ones that are trying to do political work on behalf of the diaspora. No one in UNHCR would say, no, you're not allowed to protest. And yet, from all of my interviews, it was frowned upon. There was the death of marchers, and I won't talk about the extradition because that's a fascinating story that we could leave for Q&A. But this is to say that it was quite precarious being nearby. And then some things happened. Around 2006, the king of Bhutan willingly abdicated for his son and had elections. Now, there's a lot said about whether that was real or not, and we don't really have time to talk about that, but please feel free to ask whether the democracy was genuine or whether it was a way to respond to the Bhutanese Nepalis. But nevertheless, the country is certainly moving in the direction of democracy now. I mean, they have elections, but democratic structures take a while to kind of lock in. And at the same time, the countries of the global north agree to partake in something called resettlement, where they take populations that are in protracted refugee situations and accept them as citizens completely. This is the expertise of Dr. Nath, so I know that she can speak to this. But what you see here is the number of Bhutanese refugees that were resettled to different countries. Far and away, the United States take the most, but you see they were all over, including the three that I spoke about. This is Ratan Gazmir, who lives in Adelaide. This is Mangala Sharma, that lives in Minnesota. And down here is Bhakta Gimre, who lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So what does that mean for our ecosystem? Is it a sunset now that people have left Nepal? Does it mean that that energy and that collective harm no longer works? Or is it a dawn to a new kind of activism? And in the last chapter, I talk about the new kinds of activism that we see that have been happening in places like Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in places like The Hague, and even right here in this terrible picture, but it was a screenshot from a video that I saw online that Bhakti Gimre posted when he went back to India. He cannot go to Bhutan. Bhutan will not let him back in. But from India, he took a video to say, look, my country, it's just across that river there. This representation of the land, the place I loved. It's right there, but I can't get to it. And he posts that on Facebook. There remains exile politics in Nepal itself with some individuals who never resettled. And this is a Bhutanese refugee complex that I've written about by one of the former Bhutanese refugees, where there's a memorial. And still in the camps, many, many fewer now, there are still some publications that talk about what is happening. I'm going to skip that slide because I think I'm pretty close. But this is examples of where Bhutanese refugees themselves told the story when a king came to visit Australia. One of Australia's Bhutanese refugees that was resettled told that story and said, why am I not being invited to meet the king? I'm a former resident of Bhutan. I wrote an article about it, which I'm proud of because every now and then academics are accused of being in an ivory tower, and I actually told the story, and I really try to do that work. And I'm going to skip that. I'm sad to say there has been no change despite all of this work of exile politics, no change for the political prisoners of the Bhutanese refugees who remain in prison in Bhutan. Those who had been involved in the protests or had tried to cross back over who were caught are still in prison. There has not been one facilitated return. There are openings from communication between individuals, but the king and high-level people have not engaged with any members of the Bhutanese Nepali diaspora. There is democracy. Democracy is holding, and that was one of the efforts of the Bhutanese Nepalis, but there are gaps. And there are future possibilities that could be supported by an entire exile politics system, telling a nuanced version of the history, possible return trips to former classmates. And I think there is a need for more gendered research, and I'm delighted to hear that that's what Lopita wants to work on. Excuse me, Dr. Nath.
No problem.
My argument is that technology does not make this work irrelevant. It is true that we have the internet that allows for that communication online, but with the advent of AI, where we're not even sure what videos are false, having a person that actually says, this is my story. Now, it is true that that story then gets put on video, but I think having people in locations, the real people that you meet that tell those stories is incredibly important, so it's not all just online. And the last thing that I want to say is that and this is happening in the United States right now. I said that not one return had occurred, but I'm sad to tell you that that is no longer the case. There have been some Bhutanese refugees that have returned, but not by choice. The ICE, in many of its efforts to get rid of undocumented refugees, which is a far larger and more problematic issue, has also targeted some Bhutanese refugees who never gained citizenship. And to this date, 36 Bhutanese refugees were caught up in ICE and actually forced to go back to Bhutan. Bhutan didn't want them, but because they wanted to play nicely with Trump, they accepted them. They came across the border on a plane. They were immediately that documentation that was given to them in order to get into the country was taken from them. They were forced back across the border into India. From there, they had nothing to do but go to Nepal, and those 36 individuals found themselves back in Nepal. They have no refugee status anymore. I'm sad to tell you there's been one suicide. So there is a new chapter. It's not a good one. And the Bhutanese refugees are working very hard to try to make sure that doesn't happen again and see what they can do to support those refugees. Is that homeland activism? Well, really not as much anymore. That's not so much about Bhutan as about the United States, but you can see it's an expanding role for activism. And finally, I dedicate this talk to Govinda Rajal, who was one of my research participants, an amazing, amazing man and researcher, wrote a book of his own, and very sadly was killed by a bus in Kathmandu 2 years ago. So I am sorry for taking a little extra time. I thank you very much, and you can order, I think, at a discount, my book online. You can have a Kindle version if you want, or you can order just a paper copy if you like. Thank you so much for having me.
You're muted.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going
Thank
to
you, Susan. That was
be able to hear now.
thank you for sharing your work with us. On that note, I would invite Professor Lopita Nath for her responses to the book.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Susan. It's such a pleasure to see you after many years now, but I do have your book. So I've read it cover to cover, and not now, but before. So thank you very much to Faiza and the whole Dartmouth group. And I'm so happy to be here, especially, with Dr. Coram and Dr. Banki. And I feel like the book has come at a very opportune moment, not only for borderland studies, but also for refugee activism, but also for the Bhutanese refugee issue. And I must really commend Dr. Banki for this very extensive research that has gone on this book. At the outset, I must say that this book brings to us the multifaceted nature of a refugee crisis. It has so many moving parts that are equally important to understand the whole problem. And you saw what Dr. Banki said, everyone is doing that. And especially when we think about even a crisis like the Bhutanese refugees, which is very small in numbers when you compare like other bigger refugee crises like the Syrians or others. We always see that yet scholars are still unfolding the many different aspects of this crisis on a day-to-day basis. In the ecosystem of exile politics, Professor Banki provides a very theoretically sophisticated and empirically grounded analysis of the spatial and social legal dimensions of the refugee mobilization and centered on protracted displacement of the Bhutanese Nepali population or the Lhotshampas. Banki's work challenges the prevailing digital sublime in migration studies, the notion that technological connectivity has rendered physical distance irrelevant to diaspora politics. Instead, she argues for reterritorialization of exile politics, asserting that the physical coordinates of activists remain the primary determinant of their strategic efficacy and vulnerability. Banki's most significant contribution is the introduction of the proximity precarity nexus. While traditional transnational scholarship often focuses on the resources available to the settled, especially in the settled diasporas in the global north, Banki shifts the lens towards the near abroad. She identifies proximity not merely as a geographic fact, but as a political resource. Activists situated in Nepal and India possess a temporal immediacy to the homeland, allowing for the rapid flow of raw testimonies and the execution of high visibility cross-border symbolic actions. Professor Banki, in her early chapters in her book, effectively highlights some of the factors that led to the crisis. Using, all her research, she looks at the slow progress of the disenfranchisement and the branding of the Bhutanese Nepalis as foreigners and anti-nationals or the Nugalops. This gives you the chills as one begins to see how methodical the Bhutanese government policy was in the way they started sidelining and eventually evicting the Lhotshampas. In chapter 3, which is particularly valuable as it highlights the triggers and the steps in the process. I would like to mention here the myth of a greater Nepal coined by Kanakmani Dixit in his article. And coming from the region, and later when I was working on my research on the Nepalis in Assam, I saw the same idea reiterated in many aspects of regional politics, triggered by the Gorkhaland movement in Nepal, Nepali government in Sikkim, and also during the Assam movement in 1979 and 85, which is very well mentioned in T.B. Subba and A.C. Sinha's book on Nepalis in the Quest for Indian Identity. Professor Dasgupta's Othering of the Not-So-Other and my article on conflict-afflicted Nepalis highlights the othering, incarceration, exploitation, and displacement and deportation of the Nepalis from northeast India to beyond the border of Kakribita in the India-Nepal border. And most of these can trace their roots to the fear of a greater Nepal, which raises the question of whether it was a myth or a reality. This has been mentioned by Professor Banki in her research, as this is relevant to the proximity of later Bhutanese activists as they found a sympathetic population in the border areas of Nepal and India to grow their early movement. The Bhutanese Nepali eviction a few years later could testify to this, as the fear of a rise of the Nepalis in the south and the proximity to the Indian problems with the Nepalis could have given heed to this problem in Bhutan. Professor Banki mentions the docility and placidity of the Bhutanese citizens who did not dare to protest the challenge of the Bhutanese state, while the Nepalis in the southern border areas who came under the influence of India in Darjeeling and Sikkim dared to raise their voices, strengthening her argument of how proximity and close to a physical location allows for the growth of this activism. Thich Rizal's memoir, From Palace to Prison, mentions how in the early part of his flight days, before he was arrested and taken back to the Bhutanese prison, he took refuge in the people's homes on the Assam-Nepal border and continued to protest, create pamphlets, and carry on this early activism. In a crucial theoretical intervention, Banki argues that this proximity is inextricably linked to precarity. She deconstructs precarity into three analytical categories, as she has mentioned: legal, lack of a formal status; political, the risk of a state-sponsored reprisal in host countries; and social, the erosion of community trust. This uncomfortably conjoined relationship means that the very factors that make mobilization possible also makes it inherently fragile and dangerous. And while it empowers them, it also simultaneously exposes them to intense legal, political, and social precarity because they remain within the reach of Bhutanese state influence and lack of permanent protection in the host countries. An interesting reference to this precarity comes from the proximity to India, which was both a boon and as well as a bane to the cause of the Bhutanese refugee crisis. You know, every time I deliver a talk on this crisis, I have been asked to explain India's role in this crisis and why it was different from India's existing refugee policy in the case of the Tibetans, the, Bangladeshis, the Tamils, and even the Afghan refugees to a certain extent. And this is mostly comes a lot from the Bhutanese refugee diaspora themselves. And as the story goes, after the first exodus of the Bhutanese Nepalis from Bhutan, they crossed the border, as Professor Banki mentioned, hoping to return sooner than later as it was closer to Bhutan. However, after a couple of months, the Indian border police loaded the refugees in a truck, first with the intention of forcing them to return to Bhutan, and when they refused, they dropped them across the border at Kakrabita to find their way to Nepal. And Professor Banki very aptly describes the border experience in Kakrabita. I love that story. The sounds of a chaotic border outpost, and one can imagine what it must have been to the thousands of refugees to be dropped off there, to make a decision to do whatever they did, to go without any papers. What followed were hours of wait. And finally, Nepal admitted them and offered them shelter, first in the villages, and later, when the numbers grew, to the banks of the Maidhar River, which became a scene of desperation in many ways, you can say, with disease and everything, and finally to the camps that Professor Banki has mentioned. India's policy on this goes back to 1954 during the BSC, the Bhutanese State Congress protests, when Nehru wrote to Koirala saying that we cannot allow Indian territory to be a base of operation, and asked Nepal to discourage such aggressive activities. This, in many ways, sets the tone for the Indian policy during the 1990s expulsion and later arrests and imprisonment of protesters during the marches. My point is that the policy of the Indian government should not be based on the happenings of in the 1990s, but as a part of a policy not to jeopardize India-Bhutan's relations. India's refusal to allow base of operations essentially created the political precarity that Banki analyzes. However, individual, slower activism continued on Indian soil despite this precarity. While discussing legal precarity, Professor Banki mentions how an unknown number of Bhutanese refugees remain behind in India and do so until today, living without status and at the mercy of some local officials who allow it, probably in return for some compensation. And in 2024, actually, during one of my visits to the camp, I met a Bhutanese refugee woman who was married to a Bhutanese Nepali who lived in India. She left the camps, joined her husband. This was before resettlement, losing her refugee status. Years later, her husband divorced her, and now she is with her two children. She and her children remain stateless without any legal paperwork. So this is just one example of a story, but there are many others like that. Professor Banki, in her analysis of political and social precarity, writes that engaging in politics as a foreigner carried extreme risks. In India, since India does not have a refugee policy, every foreigner that comes in falls under the Foreigners Act. Activists face arrest, imprisonment, and even death in custody. A major example is the DNC leader Kidoji, who was arrested in New Delhi and narrowly escaped extradition back to Bhutan, where he would have likely faced execution. Proximity fosters a climate of deep distrust and disunity. The constant fear of Bhutanese government spies infiltrating the camps of the border towns created special threats where even visits from relatives remaining in Bhutan were viewed with suspicion. This social precarity also led to a conflict among the activist groups over resources, access, and ideology. I believe that Professor Banki mentions in a book. And I believe the influence of the Maoist movement on the younger Nepali refugees fueled camp unrest, which in turn subjected the population in rigorous, oversight by the Nepali authorities. Many refugee leaders that touted connections, which she mentions about the lobbying, both in India and Nepal, as her example of the BNDP and the BPP, that is the Bhutan National Democratic Party and the Bhutan People's Party, and how these and other differences extended to everything from methods of activism, violence versus nonviolent, to opportunities for representation in international forums, so there was a lot of conflict that was happening towards the later part. By the mid-2000s, the advantage of proximity began to pale in comparison to the problems of precarity. The long period of languishing, which Banki writes in a lot of her earlier writings as well, depicts a point of frustration as activism began to see very few results, a losing battle for rights to return or work in Nepal or any kind of permanent solution in Nepal, compounded by the failure of the joint verification process. At this time, the offer of third country resettlement to many who were feeling frustrated by over 20 years of being, in a state of limbo came as a respite. A key strength in her chapter on the expansion of the ecosystem is the treatment of third country resettlement. And Professor Banki observes that while resettlement to the United States, Australia, and Europe effectively eliminated political and legal precarity, it simultaneously created a metabolic shift in the ecosystem where the energy moves from the physical border crossing to digital financial lobbying. The distant nodes of the ecosystem may possess greater financial capital, freedom of speech, but they often lack the visceral connection and regional networks necessary to exert direct pressure on the Drukpa-led regime in Thimphu. As Banki writes, the resettlement has now shifted the game both inside and outside. I agree with her when she mentions how by their activism seeking international pressure on Bhutan, the Homeland activists inadvertently spurred the global north to offer resettlement rather than push for return. This effectively distanced the activists from their original goal of repatriation, which also led to a divided camp in the initial days, leading to a new kind of activism between those who wished to take the opportunity to resettle and those who wished to carry on the fight for return to Bhutan. I remember meeting Mr. Narad Adhikari in 2010, which Professor Banki has worked with, and he mentioned how dangerous the atmosphere in the camps were. Professor Banki also mentions how anti-resettlement groups occasionally use violence to dissuade others, which ironically increased precarity and pushed more people towards opting for resettlement. And many years later, I met several people who were leaders in the movement to return, give up, and opt for resettlement for a better life than the uncertainty of the camps. This in many ways depleted not only the leadership of the organizations, but also human resources in the camps with teachers, camp officials, and other personnel leaving. Even for us who have been researching and writing on this issue for many years now, we heaved a sigh of relief when the majority of the refugees were resettled in third countries, hoping that life would now move on for many of them as they began new lives in the foreign lands. I, for one, was very excited as I've been studying the resettlement of the Bhutanese refugees and could not wait to see how they would shape or become a part of the South Asian diaspora. However, as we see, refugee issues never move in a never move linearly, and they are always a retrograde motion, and we see the problems of the foregone crisis looming large over the minds. With third country settlement, activism took on a different turn. The traditional forms of protesting and lobbying in India and Nepal shifted in as numbers dwindled, and only a few were left behind to carry on the torch of this activism. For some leaders, it was under duress, as Professor Banki mentioned, for those who remained behind, as the political activity barred them from resettlement, like Mr. Balram Podwal from BPP, who carried on this activism in Nepal while his family resettled. Political activism adapted to the disparate and diffuse landscape, taking different forms and methods. Leaders like Ram Karki, and she mentions about the global campaign for the release of political prisoners, and they utilized international lobbying and social media to pressure the king for amnesty. The group was very excited about the release of 3 political prisoners. The campaign is ongoing with many youths involved in the fight for the release of these political prisoners, something that happened before they were born. And and another issue that shook the diaspora in the last year, as she mentioned, was the deportation of a few resettled refugees back to Bhutan. The Asian Refugees United, a group growing out of Pennsylvania, recently met with UNHCR to address these deportations. There are other instances of international lobbying like Radio Pehchan and Bhutan News Service, where efforts aimed at retaining a unique identity linked to Bhutan, even as population becomes permanently integrated. Of particular interest for me were the youths. And, as a young lady I spoke to, she said that we are fighting the fight of our parents and grandparents. Born and brought up in the refugee camps and later resettled, these youth grew up around memories of their home too distant for them to even imagine from the stories of their parents and grandparents told. This intergenerational activism in the diaspora took on a new turn in the Gen Z movement in Nepal, and recently with Balan Shah's victory in the March 2026 elections, where the Bhutanese refugees are now calling for some action from this new government. Bhanu Dungana, a former secretary of the Kudnabari refugee camp, called on the new prime minister to deliver long-lasting justice to the Bhutanese refugees and calls for either a dignified return to Bhutan or secure and respectable integration within Nepal, as published in one of the social media platforms of the Lhotshampa Voice. It remains to be seen, as Balan's constituency is in Chapa, where a lot of the Bhutanese refugee camps are located and many refugees live. It suggests a compelling possibility that after decades of global dispersal, the ultimate resolution to this saga may still be found in the power of proximity, power of physical proximity. So, finally, in conclusion, I would say that Professor Banki's work is vital corrective to the methodological nationalism and overly optimistic views of cyber activism. By insisting on the importance of the physical body in the political struggle, she bridges the gap between political geography and social movement theory. So the Ecosystem of Exile Politics is essential reading for scholars with years of research. I love the research that she has done. It is 16 years of longitudinal research incorporating nearly 100 interviews conducted across Nepal, India, and various resettlement sites, which is really, really commendable, and it's essential reading for scholars, forced migration, and transnationalism. It provides a rigorous framework for understanding why some diaspora movements thrive while others remain trapped in a cycle of marginalization. Professor Banki successfully demonstrates that even in a globalized world, the where of activism is just as important as to the why. While Professor Banki brilliantly maps the where of activism, the moving stories of those resettled, the retrograde motion, and the intergenerational fight reminds us that the who remains the heart of the Bhutanese refugee story. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lopita. That was wonderful. Without further ado, I will invite Professor Frank Coram for his comments.
You're muted.
Apologies, I was muted there. Seeing as we're running a little bit over time, I think I'll keep my comments very brief so that we have lots of time for Q&A. And I also see that my doppelganger has shown up on the screen here. Fred Smith is also labeled as Frank Coram here. Don't know how that happened, but in any case, I wanted to thank Faiza for her kind invitation to participate in this event and congratulate Susan on a wonderful, well-researched and succinct book. And congratulations on that. So I just wanted to focus on a couple of points, some of the things that have already been mentioned, and then maybe just flesh them out a little bit with a few examples from my own experience. As you mentioned in your introduction to the book, your focus is on proximity and precarity, and you talk about how in refugee studies works functions in the same matter as a kind of ecological system, an ecosystem as you call it. And you say that organisms within an ecosystem rely on each other for survival, but also compete for scarce resources. And I think that's an interesting point to remember, this idea of competition for scarce resources. And then you also talk about the role that physical space plays in this idea of proximity and precarity. One thing you didn't talk about, which I found interesting in your conclusion, was the role of nostalgia. And I've always felt that in my own studies of diaspora cultures that the homeland is a very nostalgic place. And of course, there's the famous book by Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities, where the role of imagination comes to the forefront in terms of how, the homeland is conceived amongst diaspora communities and so forth, and the way that is associated to what you refer to in your book as place rituals. So we can come back to some of those issues perhaps in the Q&A period. But as I was reading your book, I've always approached this by thinking about spatiality as being the relationship between the center and the periphery. And that's probably because when I was a much younger scholar, still a student actually, I was very interested in pilgrimage, where the work of Victor Turner was very important, but I won't go into that due to its problematic nature. But one book that had a huge influence on me was Paul Wheatley's The Pivot of the Four Quarters, where he develops, in my opinion, I think, a very sophisticated model for the study of center and periphery. So as I was reading your book, I started thinking about proximity and precarity in relationship to center and periphery. And so that's something I want to come back to. But to quote you from your conclusion, you write that physical proximity suggests, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't want to quote you directly since I only had access to the proofs of your book, even though it was published in 24, so I don't want to misquote you, but basically I think what you're trying to say is that physical proximity suggests a larger exile community, but also more precarity. So in other words, in Nepal and India, you have a lot more Khotsampa than you would, let's say, in South America or the Middle East or the Anglophonic world, the United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand, etc. But, in my own studies of diaspora communities, and my own work focuses more on South Asian diaspora and also Tibetan diaspora. I've found that, the periphery can be just as precarious as the center. So maybe we could flip that equation a little bit in our discussions. And I'll provide a couple of examples about that at the end. So you write in your conclusion, and this is echoed throughout the book, that distant lands promise the idea of, or the notion of, permanent protection. And then you go, but it also reduces the participation in the homeland struggle. Maybe I'm simplifying it, because you do talk about the dialectical dimension of it, the dialogism that's involved, that connects the people who are closer to the homeland to the people who are farther away. And of course, that's a central idea with the idea of center and periphery, that they're constantly interacting with one another. And as you do admit, it's not just geographical in terms of proximity, but it's also in terms of activism, the transnational dimension of it, where people who are on the periphery can actually be in constant touch with the center, and so on and so forth. But you do say that distance reshapes activism, which of course I would agree with. But then you go back to the idea of the infinite tension that exists between the periphery and the center, to use the two terms that I like. And of course, the relationship between proximity and precarity. So that's the point I wanted to focus on in my concluding statement, and then an example or two that I'll give. So as I was suggesting, there can be a lot of precarity on the periphery as well. And I'll just give one example of that. But in your conclusion, you write that and I began by quoting a line from your introduction, where you said that there's this competition for scarce resources, and there's a tension that exists between proximity and precarity. And then in your conclusion, you suggest that maybe the best way to move forward is to eliminate the tension between proximity and precarity. Even though physical proximity remains central to the whole experience of being a refugee, i.e., people want to be close to home because that enables you to be more socially engaged with the problems that arise out of those situations. But so as I was concluding your book, as I was reading it, I was thinking, okay, so you published this in 2024. Here we are in 2026. And I'm glad that you sort of updated us at the end there, because a lot has happened in the last 2 years, especially here in the United States, and that's affecting the entire world. So you do mention that one of your main collaborators in your 16-year study was Mr. Kimide from Harrisburg. And Harrisburg is in Pennsylvania, and just so happens that Pennsylvania has the largest community of Lhotshampa in the United States. Pew estimates that it's about, I think you said in your book, 90,000. Pew said, I checked with Pew, and they estimate that there's about 85,000 of these Bhutanese, Nepalis living in the United States. But Pennsylvania, if you take the two major communities of Pittsburgh and Harrisburg combined, is about 5,000. And the Harrisburg community, which you mentioned in your own talk, and you also write about in the conclusion of your book very briefly, has been kind of a node of activism. And that's pretty well known. And actually, even though like I say, I've been involved in the study of the Tibetan diaspora for many decades, I wasn't all that I knew about the what was going on in Bhutan in the 1990s, but it wasn't a part of my own experience. So it really came home to me, however, in 2012, when I read an article in my university, Boston University's newspaper about a guy by the name of Tej Mishra, who was studying for a master's degree in BU School for Social Policy. And Tej grew up in Champa in eastern Nepal, and his story, according to the article that I read, was one of suffering and constant misery. But he was eventually pulled out of that and came to the United States to get a master's degree in public work, public service, and public health. But his goal was to go back, right? And so that was still, he wanted to get back to the center, so to speak. And I don't know where he is now, but that was what his goal as he was studying for his master's degree in 2012. But to show how not only the being closer to the center can be precarious, I want to provide one example from this community of people in Pennsylvania who have actually felt a lot of this precarity since ICE has been cracking down so much. And the story of Mohan Karki, I think, I don't know if you've come across him at all, Susan, in your work, but Lok Darji, who's also a former refugee himself, who's now a journalist for The Guardian, wrote a piece about him. And Mohan Karki is an example of someone who's now, you both talked a little bit about this, but I just wanted to conclude with a concrete example. He came to the United States and, with his family, he was born in a refugee camp in eastern Nepal and came to the United States. Had never been to Bhutan, didn't speak any of the languages. Married a woman from another refugee family who settled in Ohio. And, he was deported by ICE on January 13, 2026. And as Lok Dorji's article about him in The Guardian points out, he says he feels like a ghost now. And so essentially what happened to him was after he got married, his wife was with child, and he was picked up by ICE and deported. When he got to Bhutan, as he pointed out, he didn't have any papers or anything. So in his interview with Lok Dorji, he says that he was given the option of either going directly to prison or being sent off to India. So he eventually opts for going to India, where he has now been living very precariously with no idea, in hiding according to his own admittance, and constantly trying to stay in touch with his wife and lawyer in the United States so that he can at least come back here to be with his family or reunite with his family there. So I was thinking about the idea of precarity, and it's probably just as great for a lot of people who live abroad as it is for people who live closer to Bhutan on the Nepali and the Indian border. So I will just leave it there so that we have lots of time remaining for people who might want to raise some questions. But so Faiza, maybe
Thank you, Frank.
Susan would like to respond to our two things
Thank you,
before we
Frank.
go to the questions.
We have had some attendees leave the Zoom room because we are over time now, but I'm glad that we could get the comments of the respondents. I do want to invite Susan to respond to some of the comments raised by Professor Nath and Professor Korim.
Thank you so much for those really generous interventions. Lopita, it's wonderful to see you again. Last time was 2018. And I am really delighted to hear how you've engaged with the book, and I loved your use of metabolic there. I hadn't used that word, and I think we can certainly recruit that conceptually. Thank you for that. And Frank, some really, really terrific points about nostalgia. I'm really actually thinking more about solastalgia, which is this idea not of the yearning for home, but of the yearning for the place that's no longer what you thought it was. So, but I think there's something to be said about that. I will say, Facebook has made it possible for me to follow many members of the community that I would not have known. TP Misra, whom you mentioned, lives in North Carolina. The story of Mohan Karki and his compatriots is incredibly tragic. And Lok Darji, who is not a Bhutanese Nepali, but I'm assuming is from Nepali descent, just from the name, has been writing extraordinary articles about refugee situations. Not just this one, but the tragic story of a Rohingya refugee in Buffalo who was released from prison without his family being told, and he froze to death. So yeah, there's some really powerful stuff that's happening. I do think that the Trump administration has changed the equation for precarity in the most problematic of ways, in ways we never assumed. There was this assumption. I'm not sure if any of you ever saw this movie, and I cannot even remember the name of it. It was like one of these thriller adventure movies, and there's this part in it where the woman is racing for the American embassy for protection because she's being chased by a foreigner, and she runs, and the guard, the Marine, is standing at the gate, and she runs up and she screams, "I'm an American!" And the gate opens up, and she runs over the gate, and then the gate closes, and the guard says to the criminal, "Back off," like now she's safe. And, I was young and naive enough at the time that I watched that movie that I actually believed it. And now we're just in a different world, right? There was this belief like that if you were an American, if you kind of did things right and you had the passport, you were safe. And it was never the case. I mean, Mexicans, Mexican American, Americans of Mexican heritage have been deported before now. It's not the first time. But we're in a stage where the extent to which it's happening and the numbers are extraordinary. So I think we do have to change the equation, Lopita and Frank. I think we do. I'm not sure what the new occasion looks like, but I do think what it's going to mean is that Homeland politics is less and less likely to function in a vacuum, which is to say, activism is not only going to look like focusing at the homeland, it's also going to be focused at other structures because the international community has there, the moving parts that I spoke about, and thank you for your lovely compliment about that, Lopita, about the moving parts. They're far more complex now than they were even 2 years ago. And so when you are an activist, kind of working toward those moving parts, figuring out kind of where you're going to place your levers is going to grow increasingly complex. Is it going to be regional mechanisms? Is it going to be local? I want to just tell one more story and then if we have time. I mean, do I have time for one more story, Faiza?
You do. We have a question also that I would like you to answer, but you can tell the story.
Okay, one more story. Um, the very first Bhutanese Nepali refugee in the United States has become a uh, a uh, a member of government. He's a state. I've forgotten whether it's senator or representative. Do you
Okay.
remember, Lopita?
Suraj?
Suraj Budatoki. He's either a
Yeah, he's
state
a state
senator or a
rep. Yeah, state
state
representative.
rep
Yeah.
in New
Hmm.
Hampshire. He's amazing. He is constantly posting on progressive causes, not just about Bhutanese refugees. He's a courageous person. He's very
Very
bright,
courageous. Hmm.
really courageous, and quite an inspiration to the community. Much to my, I mean, I'm showing my colors here, but like much to my kind of sadness, it turns out that not every Bhutanese refugee is sympathetic to the deportation of those who have been forced to leave now. There are some Bhutanese, and by the way, this is not just true of the Bhutanese refugees, it's true of other refugee populations I study. And I'm sure looking at the diasporas of different places in South Asia, you would definitely know this. But there are many Trump supporters among recently arrived refugee populations. Like sort of once they've gotten in the door, they say like, this is this is the country we want to be a part of. Suraj is not one of those people. But it is true that Suraj's, and it's not my place to say, but Suraj's refugee story is a nuanced one. It's a complicated one. And there is a problematic belief that we have to kind of put people in their perfect categories. If Suraj did not escape in the exact way that is told by what it means to be a refugee, somehow he's not a legitimate refugee. But if you look at the treatment of Suraj's family and the families of 60 to 80,000 Bhutanese Nepalis before they were expelled, this is the story of discrimination. This is the story of being unwanted. And this is the story that is frankly going to happen more and more now, crossing different borders. So people are escaping from countries either to come to the US or to leave the US. I mean, I have a friend here who is a trans here in Australia who is escaped as a refugee from the United States right now. So I think a lot of our structures, a lot of our understandings of where the poles are, the center and the periphery. I'm going to check out that book, by the way, Frank. I didn't know it. I think they're changing now. I think we have some big magnets that are changing up the ecosystem, and I think we will the examination of it will be ever more important.
Thank you, Susan. We have a question by Akanksha Kapoor, and she says, "Thank you so much for this invigorating and enlightening discussion. As a researcher and scholar from the University of Delhi who is working on the Bhutanese refugees, your work is truly remarkable." And she's hoping if you could shed light on the methodological nuances, especially when you engaged in multiple sites. Moreover, could you also shed light on the aspect of the ecosystem being transformed from the beginning to where it is now, especially after resettlement of a significant number of refugees?
Thank you so much. I'd love to get your details and be in touch with you because actually, as Lopidi mentioned, my understanding of the Bhutanese refugee population in India is quite limited, and it would be wonderful to be in touch with scholars in India that are maybe know more than I do. So just reach out to me. Your question about methods. So I mentioned this in the book, but I didn't have a chance in my presentation. You know, I don't speak any of the relevant languages, and I know that that fault is mine. I understand what that means. It means that I'm only attending to some who are the most cosmopolitan, as it were. It means that the stories of those who may have been engaging in the camps but didn't have the opportunity to speak English are not are not present. I did use a translator from an interpreter from time to time, but actually most of my interlocutors spoke English. Um, my field work was because I'm not a citizen of the countries except for Australia and the United States. I did drop in, right? I went for weeks at a time. I think if I count over the course of the 16 years how much time I spent in Nepal altogether, it probably was 4 to 6 months. So I did spend some time there, but it certainly wasn't the same as kind of like a deep ethnography. And I did both. I mean, obviously, I did a lot of work that was not about speaking to people. As a supervisor now, I know I have students that are so eager to get in and just do their interviews right away. And I always try to say in a kindly way, take it easy. First, you should do as much deep reading as possible because once you get to that interview, you do not want to waste time saying, "Oh, where is Japa again? Can you please repeat the name of that politician again?" You really want to be as grounded with the information available in the world as possible before you even step in. So Of course, I read articles. Now, when I started my research in 2006, there was not social media the same way it is now, which meant that some of the stuff that I could easily collect now didn't exist. But of course, I read every book that was available in English. I can't speak or read Nepali. Michael Hutt's book, on Unbecoming Citizens, is the keystone book on the Bhutanese refugee issue until, I hope, I'd like to say mine. And of course, I read that cover to cover. I chased down all of those sources. There's books written by Bhutanese refugees themselves, which of course had to be taken with a grain of salt. There were the books by Teknath Rajal, whom Dr. Nath mentioned, who was a political prisoner who wrote many books himself. Also needs to be taken with a grain of salt because he had, you know, some views that we just have to read as scholars. We have to read carefully. That's all. And then finally, after having read as much as I could, read colonial documents, you know, I did spend time in the camps. I conducted the interviews that you mentioned, always mindful of power imbalances. Um, you know, again, I can tell the short version of the story I tell in the book, but I had the chance to meet Balaram Podel, who was this remarkable man who had sort of been, he was the head of the BPP, which was the party, the Bhutan People's Party, that had ended up kind of developing a reputation for some violence. And people had said to me for years, like, it might be a little bit dangerous for you to meet Balaram Podel. Be really careful if you meet him. And I finally met him. I had the opportunity in 2019, just at the end of my field research. And he came into the hotel and he spoke quite softly with a felt hat. Spoke English quite well, actually. People had said to me, oh, he doesn't speak English. Actually, his English was quite good. And we had a 2-hour interview. He was thoughtful. He reflected that the BPP, had had some problems, but it was certainly not as simplistic as just a violent organization, which some people had accused it of. Certainly the Bhutanese government had accused it only of that. And as he was leaving, he took my hands and he put them on his head, which for those of you who know South Asian culture would know that that's quite an extraordinary gesture. It's not saying that he honors me. By taking my hands and putting them on his head, he's asking for me to honor him, this old man. And he said, I hope you continue to do good work for my people. And he shuffled away. And as he shuffled away, I burst into tears. And what was going on for me? I had to ask myself. And I realized that with his shuffle and his hat and his thick accent, he reminded me of my own father, who was a refugee, not from Nepal or Bhutan, but from Hungary. But nevertheless, the idea of that, I mean, I burst into tears and I realized my positionality, which I take so seriously, and I thought about the power imbalance, and I thought about what it means to be the person with the passport and to be able to come into the camp and leave the camp. I hadn't thought about one of the true motivating factors for me, which was being the child of a refugee myself and wanting to tell those stories. So that's a part of my positionality. And of course, I take that with me now far more seriously and more mindfully, but always with respect and reciprocity. I've also done some workshops, not just interviews, but I did some workshops where I would kind of meet in kind of ethnographical field work with groups of refugees. I did some of those in the Nepali camps. And more recently, I had the great privilege, that not so much for research, but I volunteered my time at an Asian Refugees United um, leadership youth camp in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I was there last summer, and I had the opportunity actually to do some kind of youth programs with them. And I'm hoping to continue to engage because, I care very deeply about the community, and I'm proud of the fact that I think I'm well regarded. I mean, look, no scholar is going to come away unscathed. I'm sure that somebody's mad that I didn't do things one way or the other, but I think I have the respect of the community for the care and the time that I took to write this book. I didn't just get my data on the first day and drop it. I've spent the time. So I think that's part of what I would say was part of my methods. I hope that helps to answer your question. As to your second question, I'll just answer it briefly, which is to say, the ecosystem is indeed changing. It's changing profoundly. Resettlement has made that change. The democracy in Bhutan, as fraught as it is, has changed that ecosystem as well. And now we're just in a new world order. And so, I mean, I feel like some kind of map of the ecosystem would just kind of it would like move into 3D. It wouldn't, I don't even know kind of how to chart it yet. I think there's a massive research project in there right now. I don't quite know what it looks like, but I think that, it's a great question, but I don't think anybody has the answer yet.
Thank you, Susan. I mean, that was a beautiful story about, your positionality and the way it links back to your own ancestry and your own father. Thanks for sharing that with us. And we don't have any other attendees, so I would say that, we can conclude at this point. It's, we've gone over a little bit, but it was such an invigorating conversation. Thank you to Frank, thank you to Lupita, and thank you so much, especially Susan, for joining us all the way from Australia at very small
It was
hour in
such
the
a
morning.
pleasure. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for hosting. Thank you,
Thank you
Frank, and
so
thank you, Lopita. It's so
Thank you.
lovely to see you again. Lopita, I'm going to send you an email because your speech was so beautifully written. I wonder if you would consider using it as the basis for a book review that you could send to like the Journal of Refugee Studies or something.
I was actually, after I finished writing it, I thought about it, like, this actually works as a book review, and I want to
It's
add a little,
beautifully written.
I want to
Thank
add
you,
a
Frank.
little more, but I definitely want to do that, so yeah, send
Yeah,
me an email and
I
I can
will.
work on it. I thought after I wrote it like yesterday, I was,
Right.